Unlike, no. Next on this list is welcome to another video. My name is Heather, and as always, I'm reading with a vengeance. Much love to my OGs who keep coming back. If you're new to my channel, very warm welcome to you. If this is your first time and you like what you see, please give the lady some encouragement by hitting that subscribe button. I am here to talk to you about my 5 favorite books of the first quarter of the year. This is one of my favorite videos to record. Well, to be honest, to research, because I like to look back at what I read and pick out the ones that absolutely meant the most to me. I thought I was going to be hard-pressed to find 5 books that I absolutely loved for the first 3 months of this year. Because as you know, this year started off really slow. I hit a slump, and it just seemed like I was reading book after book that just did nothing for me. But as I looked back, there were a couple of bangers. Thank goodness there were 5. And I do want to be really clear, because there's a couple that I read in April that I know are going to be on my list of favorites for the year, but this list only includes books that I read January, February, and March. I could never say February. The first 3 months of the year. So let's get right into it. The first book I want to talk about is How to Ejaculate Responsibly by Gabrielle Blair. Subtitle is A Whole New Way to Think About Abortion. I really wish she hadn't had that subtitle, because this book is not about abortion. It is not the argument for or against abortion. This talks about how the idea of preventing pregnancy should be 100% the men's responsibility. She's not saying that women should stop being responsible. What she's saying is 100%, and I'll say that again, 100% of unwanted pregnancies is the man's fault. I know it sounds like a hot take, but it's not. There are 126 pages filled with solid arguments. So this has nothing to do with what side of the fence you fall on when it comes to abortion. And if you find yourself in that debate with family, friends, or whoever, or even if you're in politics, a good way to shift that argument is to not so much talk about abortion, but talk about how to prevent the pregnancy to begin with. And this will give you the tools to have a logical, intelligent debate about how to go about preventing unwanted pregnancies. Solid nonfiction book. Highly recommend. Absolutely loved it, to the point where I had to buy a hard copy for myself. Because as you know, I don't hold on to books I read normally. And I initially listened to this, and it's an excellent audiobook. But after I listened to it, I bought a hard copy for myself, as well as gifts for a couple of my friends. So do yourself a favor. Next up is In Defense of the Act by Effie Black. And that's not going to show up really well, but I wanted to hold it up to you that I read it on my Kindle. Let's get that off the screen. I'm just excited that one of my favorites of the first quarter comes from the Women's Prize for Fiction long list, because the long list did not impress me this year, but this one I absolutely loved. I was completely gutted it didn't make the short list, but it is outstanding. It's less than 200 pages, but it packs a punch. The act that is referred to in the title is suicide, and it follows Jessica, who is a scientist who is researching the tendency for humans to end their own lives. And her argument is that perhaps sometimes committing suicide isn't a bad decision. Another hot take, but don't let the darkness of that subject matter deter you from reading this book. This book has heart as well, because it follows Jessica as she talks about the relationship she had with her dad, the relationship that she has with her sister and her friends, and her romantic relationships. And the structure of the book is broken up from chapters where you're dealing in the present with Jessica, mixed in with a chapter titled The Black Day, I think, where you know something bad has happened, but you don't know exactly with who or what happened. And so there's this building of dread as you're learning more and more about Jessica, who, by the way, is a character I really found relatable and who I cared about deeply by the end of the story. I know this is a tough one to get in the United States, but if you're looking for a quick, intelligent read, that will stay with you for quite a long time. I still find myself thinking about this. Do yourself a favor, get your hands on this book because it's a banger. Next up is Ordinary Human Failings by Megan Nolan. This is the only other book on the Women's Prize long list that I absolutely loved. This is Irish literature, it's historical fiction, it's a social family drama. This is kind of marketed as a procedural crime thriller, and that is not what it is. The story opens with the murder of a child, and the number one suspect is another child, and that's what grabs you. But what keeps you is you're really not following the murder, you're following the story of the family, an Irish family who are now living in London, and you follow why they're living in London now, their experiences in London as a poor Irish family during a time where the Irish in general were not very welcome in England. There are themes of depression, addiction, teenage pregnancy. There's also a storyline of the vulturous nature of the media as you're following a journalist who is covering this murder and wants to make a name for himself, and the ethics that all of that entails. This is definitely a character-driven story, but for me, there's a perfect balance of plot and compelling characters that just made this such a good read. A lot of people say they really like this one more than the author's first novel, Acts of Desperation, I believe, but I want to read that one anyways just because I really loved the writing style. I loved how she structured the book. I will definitely be keeping an eye on this author. Another one that didn't make the short list, and I feel it was robbed. Next up on this list, and if I haven't said before, this list is in no particular order. I find it next to impossible to put favorites in an order, just because when I compile favorites, they're usually so completely different from each other that it's comparing apples and oranges, so I can't really put one above the other. I can just put them in the category of favorites. Next on this list is Holly by Stephen King. This is listed as a third in a series. It's not really a series. It just happens to be, well, I would really like to say it's just the third book that this particular character, Holly, is included in, but that's not the case either. And I won't go into too much detail of where Holly comes from, but she was introduced in the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, and I think she was so well loved in that trilogy that she was also a character in his, what initially I think started off as a standalone, The Outsiders, and then she was featured in the titular short story If It Bleeds, and then he came out with her own story. So this is really a story where Holly is the main character. She is a spectacular character. She's one of those characters you want to keep reading about and follow her, and what is she going to do next. She is a very unique young woman, and while this I think can be a standalone story, you absolutely can enjoy Holly and the thriller mystery that is this book as well without being introduced to Holly in any of his other books. But to really learn how Holly has evolved and grown and become this woman that she really wasn't when you are first introduced with her, I would recommend reading the Mr. Mercedes trilogy and then reading the other books that I talked about first. But if you don't want to do any of that, that's fine. Holly is absolutely solid as a standalone. In this one, she is dealing with the death of her mother. She's running her own private investigation business, and the latest case she gets is a missing girl. And as she investigates this case, she's learning of other missing people in the town. And the path leads her to a very unlikely couple as the suspects. And I don't want to give too much away on this one, but the mystery thriller aspect of the story is unique and completely enthralling. I absolutely loved it. If nothing else, Stephen King really knows how to write fascinating, entertaining characters, and the suspects, the bad guys, are no exception. You will be just as entertained and delighted in a very dark way by the bad guys. But there is the Stephen King touch to it. There is a horror element here, but not in gruesomeness or gore or anything like that. It's just what's going on where you just kind of have to stop and go, it's just a story. It's just a story. It's so much fun. I love Stephen King, but even if you don't and you like a good mystery thriller, please pick up Holly. It is an absolute brick of a book. I believe almost 500 pages, and it didn't feel like that. I enjoyed it 100%, and I think you would too. And finally, one of my favorites of the first quarter of the year is Small Mercies by Dennis Lehane. This is only the second Dennis Lehane book I read. I read Mystic River beforehand. I'd been wanting to get to this author for the longest time. I am not sorry I did. I loved Mystic River, and I love Small Mercies even more. This is a mystery wrapped up in historical fiction. This takes place in 1974, South Boston, right on the cusp of the busing controversy that happened. Lots of racial tension in this book, but you're following Mary Pat, who is the quintessential white woman Southie. She's raising her daughter by herself. She's already lost her son due to an overdose of heroin after returning from Vietnam. And now she is dealing with the fact that her 17-year-old daughter has gone missing. On the same night that her daughter's gone missing, a young black man is found murdered on the tracks of the train. And that has become more news than it normally would because of this busing controversy that's going on that has to do with desegregation. And so the police are giving it a lot of attention and not so much giving Mary Pat's missing daughter the attention it deserves. So Mary Pat takes it upon herself to do some digging and ask some questions. And the more she does so, the more the local mob is becoming uncomfortable and starts to warn Mary Pat that she needs to stop asking questions, and she gets herself more and more trouble. But nothing's going to stop Mary Pat from finding out what happened to her daughter. And the more she finds out, she realizes that it is somewhat connected to the young black man's murder. I could not stop reading this book. It was unputdownable. I absolutely loved it. Mary Pat isn't the most likable person. She is racist as hell. The N-word is dropped multiple times. I, for one, am not offended by that. This is what happened during that time. It was authentic to the time period that the author is writing about. It is hard to hear that word. It makes you cringe, but I think it's necessary for the reality of this story. So just be warned. But the way Dennis Lehane handles the racial tension in this story is phenomenal. And while her racism makes her somewhat unlikable, you will also root for her because she stops at nothing to find out what happened to her daughter. She is fearless, she is tenacious, and she doesn't put up with shit. And it just was a really good story about we are not just one thing. We are not just one characteristic. And even if we have a characteristic that is just disgusting, we can also have characteristics that are beautiful. So there's a lot that this book can offer you, and I highly, highly recommend it. I will continue to read his books. I will get through his backlist slowly but surely, and I'm just so pleased he has a pretty extensive backlist. So that's exciting for me. But Small Mercies was absolutely worth the read. Loved it, and I highly, highly recommend it for you guys. That's it. Those are my 5 favorite books from the first quarter of the year. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Were there any books that you thought would see on this list? What have been the favorites for you guys? I would love to know, or you could just say hi down in the doodly-doo. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.